Our artistic talents are really just a demonstration of our minds and our brain power and our problem-solving skills. We can take claim and ownership over this space because we actually help to build it. Being grounded and being rooted in your community and being rooted in who you are will always return value to you.
Welcome, Trevor, to the Get Busy podcast.
Thanks for having me down here.
All right, Trevor. So let's maybe start off talking about starting and scaling and kind of your approach since you've been involved in fostering these entrepreneurial ecosystems, really how you approach starting and scaling businesses and what it really means. Like, let's define our terms here.
So I was inspired to launch Oakstop by all the incredible talented people that were surrounding me in my community in Oakland. And those incredibly talented people were all primarily creatives and artists. These are people who I grew up with, people who I started to work with. I was building my career. And what I was recognizing was, wow, there's so much talent here that if we could just find a platform to sort of centralize that talent and showcase it, then it creates all this value for our immediate community, but then it also starts to set precedent for the surrounding, region and city for like who we are and what we can be. Additionally, at the same time, this was back in 2012, 2013, Oakland was starting to undergo this transformation that a lot of cities are going through right now, dealing with things like gentrification, real estate development, industries growing. And as a result, a lot of the real estate and business activity that was coming into Oakland was also displacing a lot of our residents and a lot of our creatives and particularly Black artists and artists of color. And so as a result, I was recognizing that our community was responding to the fact that we were being displaced and very much concerned with that. But people weren't really figuring out, like, what's the solution? I think it was either a matter of, this is something that we don't like, we're comfortable with, or I'm going to pack up and leave. I'm going to move to LA, or I'm going to move to some other part of the Bay Area, or I'll go to New York. And for me, I felt like, no, we actually have an opportunity here as creatives who really help to build this culture that is attracting all this new energy and this new investment into Oakland. I said, we have a chance to actually create a platform in this moment to get even more visibility on who we are and what we can do, and then start to be the leaders and the stewards of this new paradigm for Oakland. And so my view of it was, let's not be concerned with who's coming in. Let's actually see it as an opportunity to guide them because we're culturally grounded here. Our artistic talents are really just a demonstration of our minds and our brain power and our problem-solving skills. So let's create a platform that showcases that. And at the same time, let's do it in a business context. It's not just a matter of a cultural scene, but let's also then create a business center using real estate to then show all these other economic players that we can play in all these realms too. We're smart, we can solve problems, we can hold real estate, and we're also building businesses in these spaces as well. So that was a lot of the inspiration at the time, both really just appreciating my community, but then also recognizing a current and very significant challenge that many of them were facing and recognizing where there's challenge is opportunity.
And what about Oakstop, right? Like you're a founder, you're a member of Oakstop, and let's talk about creating community and why that is important to you and, your messages that you have out there on all your platforms.
Yeah, I definitely saw it firsthand in the sense that a lot of the gentrification that was sort of happening in downtown Oakland was directly in response to a lot of the first Friday monthly art walks that we would have in downtown Oakland. And there was an article that came out around 2012 that what was called the Oakland Art Murmur. They said and this is an article that came out in the New York Times. It said the Oakland Art Murmur has grown into a roar. And so the message there was this small little arts community has now become something that's nationally recognized. And so we then saw, all of folks from Silicon Valley, from San Francisco, people showing up on the weekends to sort of check out the art scene. And so I happened to have built, before I had Oakstop, I had actually created like a pop-up gallery with a cousin of mine and another local artist. And we were one of the sort of most trafficked spots during these Oakland Art Murmur nights. So we literally witnessed this firsthand in terms of the growth of that scene. And then even before that, you know, I went away to college and came back to Oakland after being on the East Coast for 4 or 5 years. And when I came back, I was also seeing that now all of a sudden people were starting to do things in downtown, where previously downtown was more like an urban office park. You know, people didn't hang out in downtown on the weekends. And so we started to see that this activity downtown then was bringing new like residential developments and things like that. And so a lot of my same friends from my music scene and my artist community, they were saying, you know, you should consider buying something in downtown because all this is going to change. So we were right there, and we were, you know, running an independent hip hop label in downtown Oakland, actually on the same exact block where Oakstop is now. Back in, you know, 2002. And at that time, it was like nobody wanted to be downtown. So, you know, young 19, 20-year-old kids were able to rent office space at that time and run an independent hip hop label that, you know, was probably not making tons and tons of money, but we were able to sustain an office space then because nobody wanted to be there. So to fast forward then, you know, another decade or so and start to see now that nobody can afford to be downtown, everybody wants to be there. It was just interesting to see like this is changing, but also this is where we've always been. So we really, for me, there was no concern over saying we can take claim and ownership over this space because we actually helped to build it.
You're right. And community, like go back to the community part.
Sure. So for me, creating community is important because that is really how you build and create value, and that's also how you learn and grow in life. Again, I spoke first to the whole sort of premise for Oakstop was I had this incredible artist community surrounding me. These are all people who I learned so much from my teenage years all the way up to, you know, my 20s and 30s, being surrounded by other creatives. I was constantly just absorbing and soaking things up like a sponge. And if I hadn't had friends of mine who were, some of them just family friends, who then, as we grew, you know, became artists, I wouldn't have ever been able to break into any of these things that I then was able to turn into real value. And so for me, I always look at the value of social capital. And it's something that I think can be overlooked at times. And, you know, I recognize that I grew up with the privilege of having parents who were just also very well connected just in the community, right? Let alone in other spaces. Everywhere we went growing up, you know, we couldn't go anywhere with my mother without her stopping and seeing somebody that she was then going to have that long conversation with. And, you know, when you're young, you dismiss that as, you know, this is 2 more minutes that I'm away from my video game. But you start to realize as you get older, like, oh, wait, now because my mother had this relationship with this person, they're looking out for me when I'm trying to get that job. They're looking out for me when I had my first film and was trying to find places to screen it. When I had my first business and was looking for clients. You know, all those things are all community. So it's both a matter of learning and growing because you're being inspired constantly by people that know different things, have different skill sets. But then also it's a matter of access, right? And the ability then to advance as you're growing and learning, the ability then to advance and step into new arenas. They often say, you know, your network is your net worth. And I believe in that so much. And so when you're thinking about, you know, issues of economic instability and displacement and trying to build economic mobility for a certain community, one of the core pieces is how do we build your social capital? And one of the best ways to then do that is let's create a space that people relate to and feel like they belong to. And as they interact with that space, they're going to embrace people at that space and in that space much differently because they're saying, well, if you connect to this, then I connect to this. And that means you're one of us. How can I help you? How can we build? How can we connect? Do you need to meet someone? Do you need access to capital? Do you need somebody who can help you with your next project? A lot of the people that were first at Oakstop were filmmakers. And a big part of it was just we want to have access to other people who can shoot, other people who can edit, et cetera, et cetera. And so we wanted to make sure in building Oakstop that the idea of community was really sort of driving the value. I think the other question you were asking was around diversity and inclusion in entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think overall, you have to look at perspective when you're talking about creating value. You're talking about building businesses as entrepreneurs, and you can't have perspective if you don't have the right level of diversity. And so when I was thinking about why Oakstop in particular would be valuable, is I recognized that it was important to have diverse perspectives at the table when you're looking at economic development. When you're looking at all this new wealth coming into a community and creating new, like literally building new buildings, building new businesses, culture is evolving. You need to make sure you have different perspectives that are at the table. And so if you build a institution and an establishment that's at the epicenter of that, we're literally on top of the most trafficked BART station in the entire Bay Area subway system, then people are going to say, okay, well, let's see what this person has to say. If we want to have a focus group or a conference or what have you, let's do that at Oakstop. So the ability then to have those different perspectives is actually going to make any idea stronger. And if you think about it, whenever you've been doing a creative project, the way that creative project ends up being successful is if you can get enough different audience types to look at what you're doing, what you're building, and then figure out, like, how do I round this out most effectively so this is going to appeal to everybody.
But I think there's more to it than just, a co-working space. How do you take the culture of a co-working space and turn it into a larger movement? Do you?
That I was doing something new and different. And at the time, this is 2013, 2014, when we were launching Oakstop. At the time, most of the Oakland community didn't even know what co-working was, particularly Oakland's community of Black artists. And I was just telling the story the other day how when we first opened Oakstop, the very, very first day, some of my closest friends who are also artists in Oakland, we basically just sent out a series of like mass text messages to say, we've created a new space, come by and check it out. And this was to all the sort of, prevalent artists in Oakland at the time. And so all these folks show up and everybody's excited because they see, familiar faces, and it's like, oh, you're dope, you're dope, you're dope. Okay, and we're all here, perfect. And people are really excited. And then there was this moment where it was like, well, what do we do here? And I was like, it's co-working space. They're like, what's co-working? So this is 2014, and 10 years ago. And at the time, everybody was looking at me like, this doesn't make sense to us. And as a result, we don't see how you're going to be successful with this. And so that was definitely one of the biggest challenges, was just bringing something new to the table. And without people even tasting it or understanding it, they're like, I don't know if I'm going to like that. I don't know if this is going to be successful.
Right.
And, it was great because we started with just who we are and what we had, which was, our art and each other. And we started actually more so just by throwing parties. I mean, there was probably less co-working happening there for the first few months and just more, great parties. But that was able to then sort of create that cultural validation locally where people are like, okay, this is the spot to be. I don't know about this co-working thing yet, but if you show up on Friday night, there's something going on there. But I think that what was really interesting about all of it was we were now introducing this new thing and trying to figure out where it's going to hit and who's going to resonate with it. And at the same time, we were targeting a demographic that people used to also question me. They said, so you created a co-working space, which is already sort of this new thing that we don't really understand. And then on top of that, your target market are Black artists. They're like, that's at the intersection of there's no money. How are you going to build a business with a customer base that historically has no money? And I was like, well, the reason they don't have any money is because they're spending the money they have on other things. So if we can actually change spending patterns and spending behavior and consumer behavior to actually appeal to something that's going to help folks with their current economic position, then not only are you now shifting what they're able to consume and what they're able to spend on, you're building brand loyalty because they realize that you've tapped into something they needed of real value versus spending their money on things that are not valuable. And that's elevating, them in their pursuits. So I'd say that was one big challenge. And then in terms of our edge, same thing. It's like always just doing something that's new and different and that's authentic. Right? I think one way that people fail is they're constantly trying to do something other than who they are, right? People just have this tendency to say, well, if I'm in business, I just need to emulate. Let me look at the last successful business and try to study everything they did and just do it, maybe do it better or do it faster or put more money behind it. And I think that obviously sometimes will work out for people. But if we're talking about creating value, oftentimes creating value is creating something that is unique, that's not already there. And the only way you can do that is by being authentic. So we have definitely ventured into areas with our business that other co-working spaces or other event venues or what have you just wouldn't bother doing because they say, well, that's not what we see and we don't know that it's going to be the safe bet. But I say, well, this is not what we see. This is who we are. So we have to do that because that's who we are. So for instance, we started a nonprofit after the first 6 or 7 years because we found that we were doing so much impact work in the community, supporting the community, offering free services and things like that, that it was like, well, let's do that because that's who we are. And it's also something that sets us apart. So now in many ways, we're also equally recognized in the sort of nonprofit impact and philanthropic spaces as we are in the world of co-working and event venues. And so throughout building the business, going from co-working, then saying we're going to be a events and meeting hub and even a conference center, to being an art gallery, to being a workforce development platform and an entrepreneur support platform. We also even have been running mental health and wellness programs. These are all things that speak to just who we are, and it's not only natural, but it's also necessary to just continue to dive into who you are and then let that be expressed through the work that you do through your business.
Let's move on from that right now. And I mean, I know that co-working space is an event business. It's very, very competitive. So let's talk about how you keep your competitive edge in really what has become a saturated market with co-working spaces, accelerators, incubators.
Right, exactly. And so the edge comes about by after people spend their dollars on emulators, they realize that they want the original thing. And so people will come to us eventually because they'll say, well, I've tapped into all these other things and there's something about it that maybe felt a little artificial or something that didn't feel as genuine as what I wanted. And I come here and you guys are the real deal. And so being grounded and being rooted in your community and being rooted in who you are will always return value to you, because at the end of the day, that's what people are looking for. They're looking for who can be their natural self and who can be rooted because they're looking for what's real. That's all people want is what's real.
Yeah, I kind of got that from reading your background. So let's talk a little bit about creative entrepreneurship and really what role creatives have in entrepreneurship and in, really impacting the economy. I mean, creativity is often sort of put over in a box, with the focus on technology. Let's talk about how important the creative sector is to what you're doing, but really to what we're doing as a culture and an economy.
So I've always said throughout my career that creativity drives business. Right? Creativity, in my mind, is the ability to take an idea from your mind, from your imagination, and then translate it into something material that you can see or that you can touch, you can feel. That's all you're doing in business. You're taking ideas and bringing them in reality and then handing it off to a customer who then pays you for that idea you've brought into reality. And the people that have built that muscle the best are creatives. I started my career as a creative director, actually I was working for a billionaire at the time, sort of at the intersection of tech and VC and philanthropy. And I built their first creative department within this organization. They previously didn't have that. They had some designers and things like that in different sort of areas and divisions of the organization. And I created a department that basically centralized all that creative talent into one department, and then that one department served all the different divisions in the organization. And when we were building the department, we were talking with HR, and they were saying, okay, we're working on the design team department, and we want your thoughts. And I said, well, one of my thoughts is we're not going to call it the design team. We're going to call it the creative team. They said, well, why? And I said, because designing is what you do with your hands, is what you make. Creative is what you do with your mind. And what we're here to do is we're here to bring thinking to the business space, whether it is tech or VC or nonprofit or philanthropy. We're here to help evolve thinking. And then the creative products are now just a representation of new thinking. But it's not just making things. And if we as the creatives are simply taking directives from the business leaders, those ideas may not be as dynamic as they could be. So for me, I've always translated that then to sort of broader business and entrepreneurship, that creatives always need to be at the executive table. Because whenever a CEO is trying to figure out how to evolve their business, they're doing creative problem solving. And some of our, most loved and famed CEOs are artists, or at least they identify as artists. And so it's important to just recognize that while society has sort of labeled artists as those that are sort of less inclined towards commerce, less inclined towards business and profits and things like that, it's actually that creative thinking that comes from artists that creates all the other innovation that we have in business. And so I'm just always trying to make sure that artists and creatives are, again, at that table and recognized as those leaders themselves. And if they're not the leaders themselves, and they're key advisors to those leaders to make sure that the thinking is creative. And so one way that I think that creatives can sort of balance that artistic and creative side with the business side is it's just like anything else, right? If you're going to play a sport, you gotta work both muscles, right? If you're playing basketball, you got to have, you got to be able to dribble with your right hand and your left. Same thing with soccer. I've been coaching my daughter on soccer, and I just told her, I said, start just kicking the ball with your left foot, right? So both sides of the brain, left side, right side, you got to constantly exercise them, but then you also got to understand the interplay between the two. How can the right side of your brain pass the ball to the left side of your brain, right? And so for me, in a lot of ways, that is oftentimes organizing ideas. There's a whole lot of creative ideas that sort of pop up. And if we don't embrace the idea of organizing as well, which is something that sometimes words like organize and structure are kind of like kryptonite to artists. If you can embrace that organization, now you can start to look at all your ideas once you've organized them into a system, and you can then start to recognize other patterns in your ideas. And then that brings about the next creative idea. So it's not about sort of limiting your creativity and trapping it. It's more so giving it greater context within the broader context of your mind and your imagination, all the things you think about. You start to realize the commonalities and the connections between all these different ideas that you had. And so, one of my favorite artists is Prince. And one thing that Prince learned how to do was he learned how to organize his creative ideas. And he recognized that there was no such thing as a demo, right? Everything that he recorded as, this is a song and we're going to store it. We may not put it on this album, but I'm going to create this database to organize all my creative ideas. I'm going to call it the vault. And so a lot of people have heard about the vault. They see other music coming out of the vault. But what they don't recognize is that most Prince albums were built based on what was already in the vault. And then it was just a matter of saying, okay, well, we know where this is here. Let's put this there. Let's put that there. If he wasn't organized, he wouldn't be able to put out all those albums and be so prolific and then also inspire the new songs, because he says, okay, well, I'm bringing these 5 songs from the vault. I got these new 5 songs. I need 3 more for this album, but now I can figure out what 3 new ones I need to make based on what I've been able to put together so far. Similarly, I think that flipping it over on the other side in terms of how business can be enhanced through creativity is it's important to be able to visualize your ideas. It's important to be able to take something and organize it in a way, whether it's visual or whether it's through poetry or music or what have you, to be able to put all those things out there so then you can actually start to understand what are the best business ideas. I fell in love with just the art and practice of whiteboarding very early in my career. I know a lot of people use whiteboards, but my whole thing was I found that I was able to get business ideas more clear when I gave myself a kinetic process for releasing those ideas. Standing up, moving my body, being able to work spatially. When I was building my creative departments, I would, put whiteboards all over all the walls. You couldn't really go anywhere there wasn't a whiteboard. When I built Oakstop, we started painting entire walls with whiteboards, because that process of moving around and moving your body, it's also doing something for your mind. It's keeping your mind from being stagnant, so that then all those new ideas can come up, right? So business people are used to sitting at desks and chairs on computers. And I actually find sometimes that I want to get the best ideas out. I need to get away from the computer, because it's this small box, and it's sort of confining and constraining me to, this small space of movement, such that I can't really think, more broadly. So I often think that there's this imperative to make sure that when you're trying to build a business and when you're trying to bring about business ideas, you need to also figure out, how can I do this in a creative way? How can I manifest it in something that I can perceive with my senses? When I was in art school, my design teacher would always say to us, when in doubt, draw it out. And that is a practice and a skill and a mantra that I've kept with me, now for decades. And I think it's something that some business leaders don't necessarily have as a practice. It's not a skill or muscle they've built to be able to have an idea and say, okay, now I'm going to draw this out and design it. When I make pitch decks, I focus on all the layout first, because all the layout and the format and the design, now it starts to organize my business ideas, because I have a lot of business ideas, but it's the art sometimes that helps me think through, how do I make the best idea stand out the most? And that creative process then is fueling how I start to evaluate my ideas and how I start to prioritize and create hierarchy for what's really most important.
No, I see what you're saying, and it just seems to me like, have we in this space, the whole co-working, WeWorking, incubator space, has that market peaked? Are we on the other side of it? Like, where do we go from here? Is it building communities? Like, what? Talk to me a little about that.
Yeah, so I sum all that up in the phrase, the future of work. Right? The future of work includes where we work, how we work, and what we're working on. And for co-working, it's interesting for me to have built a co-working space in 2014. And then, it was roughly 6 years or so into the pandemic. When we started it, again, in Oakland, in our community, it was still sort of a niche thing. It wasn't for another few years until it really grew. And WeWork wasn't in our neighborhood when Oakstop was first created. Just to kind of give a sense of that market comparison. But it was interesting because 6 years into building the business, then you have this pandemic, and the whole message is, we can't be indoors, we can't share space, we can't be in community, which in many ways was the essence of co-working. And on top of that, you had the entire working world saying, now you need to work from home. So I remember, May 2020, friends of mine from high school was like, hey man, how you doing? How's your family? You must be just hurt because of what happened with COVID. Like, I'm sure your business is falling apart. And I was like, well, it's on pause for sure. But I always felt like there's still value for community, and community is still relevant in these times, regardless of, how that community is sort of structured and formatted. So I was hopeful. And what we found now, we were able to survive and make it through the pandemic. We also happened to grow our business during the pandemic. We actually doubled in size during the pandemic because there is this sort of major, transition with commercial real estate where people didn't have any interest in it anymore. So because we were so embedded in the community, all the commercial real estate opportunities started to flow our way because, we don't know what to do with this anymore, right? So with that said, now in this new paradigm, I think that we haven't reached the peak. We're actually still going to see the peak where the relevance of this model of sharing space is going to become even more pronounced. One of the interesting shifts for me with co-working, at least for our work, is that prior to the pandemic, co-working appealed more so to, entrepreneurs, small startups, nonprofits, outfits that were smaller in size in terms of employee headcount. However, now since the pandemic, the larger corporations are starting to recognize the value and the benefit of having a really small sort of section of space within a co-working area. Some people had already been doing some of this earlier on, but they were doing this larger sort of enterprise play where, your company headquarters of, a couple hundred people could be based out of a WeWork or something like that. But now some of the other companies, the Cloroxes of the world and, Kaisers and places like that, they're trying to explore opportunities for, we just need space for like 6 people in this region. And we don't want a 5,000, 10,000 square foot office space. But we do need office space because these people, based on the nature of their work, being at home all the time just isn't actually, it's not doable. It's not appropriate. So how can we find, 500 square feet of space with the possibility of being able to sort of fan out and expand from time to time? How can we find that without having to commit to a long-term lease? So it starts to make this shared flexible space model far more relevant. And what we're going to see in the next couple of years, as the commercial real estate community is talking about, is they talk about this, they call it almost like a maturity wall. And it's maturity in the sense of loans and debt. There's several commercial buildings that have debt and mortgages on them that are maturing in 2025. And the people that have been holding these buildings, typically larger institutional real estate investors and things like that, their tenants have been since gone for a while, and they've been holding the building through whatever means they've been doing so. When those loans come due, what they're saying is a lot of these larger institutional landlords are just going to hand in the keys to the bank. And so all these buildings are going to go back to the banks is what is being anticipated right now. And it's not that some other corporations are going to step in and say, okay, we want to put, a couple hundred employees back into this commercial space. So there's going to be a natural correction in terms of the use of commercial assets. And we're going to see that happening over the next, 10 to 20 years, where the built environment isn't going away and corporations aren't going away. But the way in which corporations interact with the built environment will change. And so a lot of that change is going to be represented through the idea of having smaller amounts of space, having greater flexibility for how people occupy that space and use it. But then also we're going to see a rise in more and more interest in being able to be in shared spaces, to have that sort of, not just the collaboration, but also the ability to have a more intersectional approach to business. Companies are going to want to be in areas where they're seeing other companies around them that are inspiring what they do. And I think we've seen that in the tech space, we've seen it in the startup space, but what happens when you start to see that in like financial services and, much larger corporations and manufacturing and things like that, even in the restaurant industry, ghost kitchens and things like that have become more and more popular. So I don't think that we've hit a peak. I think that we're still sort of growing with the larger market, the larger real estate market, into an entirely new paradigm where commercial real estate is going to start looking for flex space operators in general. And they might even be calling it co-working at that time. But really what they're going to be looking at is who can help us manage several different customers in this building at once, versus the old way where commercial real estate was focused on get as few tenants as you can to fill this building. That's why the whole concept of an anchor tenant is there. It's like find one tenant that can fill, at least 33% of this building. And then that's one check that's coming to you, and you only have to put in the work of collecting one check. But what's going to happen is that those same minds, those same investor types are going to need some kind of operational model for picking up all the small checks. And that's going to be represented through sort of flex space operation.
Yeah. Yeah. And, this last question, how do you stay motivated, right? Like for me, one of the great joys of my life is immersing with entrepreneurs and creatives, and you're doing that every day. You're in it. What motivates you? And really, let's talk a little bit about the future of Incubators. Let's close on that note. Like if there are entrepreneurs out there who are looking for a space, talk about that.
So what keeps me inspired, what keeps me going is understanding that entrepreneurship is a journey. And in many ways, when you're on a journey, you start to realize that you're truly living life. You are charting your own course. You don't necessarily know where your destination is going to be, and you're also far away from where you started. And that's when you really start to feel like you are living. If you look back sort of anthropologically at older civilizations and cultures, people found life through their ability to journey. And so being able to go on that journey as an entrepreneur, it's the thing that wakes me up every day. It's like something new is going to happen. I'm going to be faced with opportunities. I'm going to be faced with challenges, really odd things, unexpected things. But it's also this recognition that you are actually like living life. You're much more alive than if everything was sort of planned out for you. And if we think about it, like that's how we naturally grow and evolve. I mean, everyone's independent story is about the point at which they find their own independence and the point at which they can start to pursue whatever that is. And that may not be a business. It may be somebody wants to go and live in some other part of the world, but it takes them time to be able to prepare for that and go and do that. Artists are on a journey for themselves as well, where they're saying, I want to be visible, or I want to learn how to express myself in this way, or I want to connect with people. And so for me, entrepreneurship is just something that continues to inspire you, and it forces you to really just be yourself, right? So I first sort of talked about the idea of like living your life, but then ultimately another way of looking at that is just like further understanding who you are and embracing who you are and growing who you are, right? Because you're constantly faced with those challenges. And at the end of the day, sometimes some of the biggest challenges in entrepreneurship is just how you want to manage yourself, how you want to manage your being in that moment. If it's a tough conversation you have, if it's, working really hard and having to push towards a goal, or if it's even how you celebrate yourself and how you show up for yourself and tell people that you're happy and that you're proud of what you're doing. All of these things are about just learning who you are. And so the advice that I give to other entrepreneurs in terms of what keeps them going is make sure that this is still something that ties back to who you are. The product itself doesn't necessarily have to be something that ties back to your roots or what have you, but the journey that you're on and what you're doing really has to reflect who you are. And it ultimately comes down to the question of like, do you know who you are? Do you know yourself? And if you don't, then use this as an opportunity to dig deeper, to learn and figure out who you are and sort of what you bring to the table. Because at the end of the day, if we're always measuring ourselves simply by success and failure in business, then you're never truly going to be happy, right? Because the next success now just presents a whole nother hill, a whole nother mountaintop to climb. But when you start to more so dig into an understanding and appreciation of who you are, then you recognize, again, back to that same principle, now you're unique, you're authentic, and that's your value. And then you recognize, well, I can take this value that I have anywhere. If this venture doesn't work out, then it'll be the next venture, it'll be the next venture, it'll be the next venture. And, some people talk about that is sort of the reality and the existence of startup founders is that they build something, it might succeed, it might fail, but then what people recognize is how they showed up in that spectrum of failure and success. And then they say, okay, based on how you showed up, let's apply you to something else now, right? So I just inspired people, I encourage people to be inspired by the fact that they're fortunate enough to have the experience. And oftentimes, again, in life, like that's what it all comes back to, right? Whether you're a young person and your parents are trying to get you into things and you don't like it, you're on the football team or the basketball team and you lost every game and you got beat up, your parents say, well, at least you experienced it. At least you got exposure, right? You go through other things in life and it's like, what's the phrase? It's better to have loved and lost than never loved at all, right? People, when they're in their last moments of life, they often start to say like, well, what are the things you remember? You don't remember your job. You don't remember the bills you paid and all this kind of stuff. What you remember is the moments that you really allowed yourself to live, the moments that you really allowed yourself to have that experience. So entrepreneurs are lucky enough to be putting themselves through that experience on a daily basis while also learning to make a living for themselves.
Thank you for the work you do on behalf of the entrepreneurial ecosystems, around the country. And I wish you so much luck and success.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for having me.